from Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock. The Prime Minister says he would never have appointed Lord Mandelson if he'd known then what I know now. The former British ambassador to the US was sacked last week over his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which was deeper than first thought. Sir Keir Starmer says it was vastly different to what he knew at the time he was appointed.
On top of that, he was not only questioning but wanting to challenge the conviction. That, for me, went and cut across the whole approach that I've taken on violence against women and girls for many years, and this government's approach.
A mother and father have been jailed for at least 14 years over the death of their baby daughter. Constance Martin and Mark Gordon went on the run, staying in tents in freezing conditions to avoid her going into care. Kemi Badenoch says she won't be blown off course by the first Conservative MP defecting to Reform UK. Shadow Minister Danny Kruger described the decision as personally painful, but says his former party is over. And 8 people have been charged after disorder broke out following protests in central London at the weekend. Up to 150,000 people turned out for the Unite the Kingdom rally. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 6 points at 92.77. The pound buys $1.36 and €1.15. LBC weather staying very windy tonight. Showers for Northern Ireland, South Scotland, central Northern England and Wales. Lows of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Very wild winds are gusting through Westminster, and across politics tonight, things are getting wilder still. After the vast weekend march by anti-migrant nationalists in London, incited to violence by Elon Musk, Keir Starmer has told his MPs a battle for the soul of the nation is now going on. But there's also a battle for the survival of Keir Starmer, with ministers telling me his authority in cabinet is now heavily damaged and it's only a matter of time before there is an attempt to remove him. The issue he faces most recently, of course, is over Lord Peter Mandelson, the former US ambassador and friend of Jeffrey Epstein, and what Starmer knew when he was appointed. Earlier today, he gave this response.
Peter Mandelson, before he was appointed, went through a due diligence process. That's the propriety and ethics team went through a process. And therefore, I knew of his association with Epstein. But had I known then what I know now, I'd have never appointed him.
Regrets, I've had a few. The latest is over Paul Ovenden, Starmer's head of strategy, dismissed from Downing Street this afternoon after the publication of old but disgusting messages he'd sent about Diane Abbott. Meanwhile, with the deputy leadership election in progress and much talk of the mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, heading south to challenge Starmer, it is all undoubtedly going a bit Game of Thrones. Red wedding, anyone? Well, I'm joined in the studio now by Daenerys, Queen of Dragons. Well, not quite, but it's Aggie, Chambre, our political correspondent, standing in for Daenerys, Queen of Dragons. Welcome. I hope you haven't brought a dragon in, but you have brought in some pretty hot breath from the Commons, where, again, the Prime Minister has had just a miserable day.
A miserable day indeed, as one Labour MP said to me this afternoon. It's just one damned thing after another. And I think, Andrew, they are increasingly fed up and just can't really believe that things keep on happening. So, of course, today we've had what you just heard with Lord Mandelson and Keir Starmer still being asked questions about what he knew and when. Today, he said that he did know before Prime Minister's questions last Wednesday. You'll remember at Prime Minister's questions, of course, he said Lord Mandelson had his full support.
He was kind of skewered by Kemi Badenoch at that point, wasn't he?
Indeed. So at that point, when he stood up in the Commons at Prime Minister's questions, he knew that questions had been put to Lord Mandelson that Lord Mandelson had not yet answered. He knew that was with the Foreign Office, but he was unaware, he says, of the contents of the messages that led to his sacking.
I want to bend over backwards and try to be fair at this point. There's a time difference with the United States. You know, he's asked some questions. What he's got back so far isn't lethal, and the really bad stuff is still to come. Was there anything else he could have done then?
Well, the Foreign Office did have at least some of the emails on the Tuesday. The Foreign Office was aware of more than Number 10 was. And then Keir Starmer went into the Commons, some say went into the Dragon's Den, and was asked these questions. And I think the thing that Labour MPs have said to me is, why didn't he get everything? Why did he stand up and defend Lord Mandelson before he knew absolutely everything?
Yes, I guess in answer to my question, he could have said, listen, I know there's a lot of concern about this. I haven't got all the information I yet need, but for the time being, he's doing a good job, or something like that.
He could have done, but Kemi Badenoch, I'm sure, would have then asked question after question after question, and that would have basically been lethal for Peter Mandelson as well. So he was in a difficult position at that stage. But then, of course, he said today, you know, had I known what I know now when I appointed him, I never would have appointed him. And one minister sent me a message after that saying, this is the problem, admit you were wrong. And so I think there is a lot of kind of bad feeling in the PLP towards Keir Starmer, and that has not helped. And frankly, the situation with Paul Ovenden hasn't helped either.
Well, let's talk about Paul Ovenden, not somebody that many listeners will know by name, but the head of strategy, quite a big job at Number 10.
It's not just that it's quite a big job at Number 10, but it's quite a big job that he's had throughout his career in the Labour Party too. He's seen as someone who was integral in getting Keir Starmer elected. He worked for the Labour Party for a long time in opposition. He writes Keir Starmer's speeches, and lots of people have said, you won't have heard of him, but he is someone who is completely integral to the project. And actually, he was sacked over these messages he's sent in 2017.
They're old, aren't they? They're about 8 years old, these messages, but they are pretty foul.
They are indeed, and they show Paul Ovenden and two female staff members, Labour staff members as they were then, discussing sex acts involving Diane Abbott. Downing Street have described those messages as appalling and unacceptable, and Ovenden has said he's truly, deeply sorry for it and the hurt it will cause.
Just another day at the ranch. Aggie, for now, thank you very much, because I'm joined by Ed Miliband, Energy Secretary, reshuffle survivor, and one of the most popular ministers in the Labour Party. Ed, I said reshuffle survivor there. Keir Starmer did want to get rid of you from your job. I had a conversation with you. You've pushed back, as I understand it. You can tell me if I'm wrong. But doesn't that leave a big question mark hanging over the whole net zero agenda? What you are in Cabinet to do?
Nah.
Which bit's a nah?
It doesn't. Look, Keir and I are both extremely committed to the clean energy mission. It's his clean energy mission. He was very, very happy for me to carry on staying doing this job. This is a job I came into his shadow cabinet to do. It's a mission that we devised in opposition, and which we're now getting on with delivering and implementing in government.
Why were the second thoughts from Number 10?
There aren't second thoughts from Number 10. You know, I was just with Keir at an event we were doing with the nuclear industry, and we've got big investments that we're announcing today from US nuclear companies, UK nuclear companies, a real vote of confidence in our clean energy mission. And, you know, it's one of the things he is most passionate about because of the jobs it will create, because of the energy security it will bring to the country. I
want to move on from this. I'm sure you do as well. But let me ask you very directly, did he ask you to move jobs?
Andrew, you are a very experienced journalist. I'm certainly not going to get into my conversations that may or may not have happened with Keir Starmer, my friend of almost 20 years.
All right. But you are convinced, because, you know, there is an argument that says you're taking on reform, you're trying to neutralise those issues.
Win the argument.
Those issues that reform are going for you. Reform go on now endless about net stupid zero. And there would be some sort of strategies. So, well, in that case, let's pull back from what we're doing a bit.
You know, that's not the impression I get from anyone, either Keir Starmer or anyone around him, because they recognise that this is about the jobs of the future. And I think what's so interesting is that we have a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who are, and I've been around a long time, who've been more, did this job before, who are more committed to this agenda than any of their predecessors. Because Rachel Reeves sees it as central to her economic strategy and her growth strategy, and she's right. Keir sees it central to his mission to create opportunity for people, change our economy. So we are absolutely all square. And look, it's a big fight with reform, and I relish the fight. Let's have this fight about whether we should turn our back on the jobs, whether we should leave ourselves at the mercy of petrostates and dictators and subject to fossil fuel gyrations that happen in these international markets. And it's a fight we intend to win.
This has been, I'm sure we can agree about this, a really miserable period for the Prime Minister for all sorts of reasons. And there is a lot of talk about whether he can survive till May, whether he will survive beyond May. And, people are talking right across the Labour Party about this. Andy Burnham is looking south from Manchester and wondering what to do next. You are, I know these terms are pretty unappealing to you, but you are in effect the leader of the soft left.
Oh, people are getting very overexcited. Look,
tell me where you think he actually is.
Well, look, we've been through a turbulent couple of weeks because we lost the Deputy Prime Minister. Peter Mandelson had to go, and it's right that Keir did that. But what matters in politics is you go through these periods of turbulence is that you stay focused on the mission. And Keir knows exactly what he's about, which is making this country better for working people, investing in our public services, changing our economy so it works for people, giving more rights at work. We're voting tonight on the Employment Rights Bill, the bill that Angela Rayner put through, 100% committed to that. The government's 100% committed to that. Much better rights for working people. So you keep your eyes on the prize and you keep your eyes on the British people when these, and you've been around a long time. Governments go through these kind of times.
So what needs to change at the centre? Because something clearly needs to change. Is it tone? Is it political grip? What is it?
Look, Keir made a whole series of changes. He's got excellent people in there. I think what Keir will do in the party conference speech is he will set out what he believes, where the country is, where the country needs to go, take the fight to our political opponents, and I think stay focused on the British people. That's what I think we need to do. Because, I'm not saying the issues of the last couple of weeks haven't been important. Of course, they're very legitimate issues. But the most important thing that matters to people is my son or daughter going to have a job? Are the public services going to be there when you need them? And actually, when you look at what this government is doing, cutting NHS waiting lists, investing in jobs as we're doing today, as I say, with new nuclear, giving more rights at work, we're doing the right things for what the British people want to see, and we need to make sure we deliver on those things.
You mentioned the legitimate issues. One of them is obviously Peter Mandelson. You've known him a very, very long time. He's resigned not once, but twice in the past over sort of real problems. Was there any party that looked at this original proposal to put him there as ambassador again and thought, well, very, very clever guy, but there is real risk here?
Look, I think it's very easy for people to have 20/20 hindsight. What we know is that, as Keir said today, if he'd known then what he knows now about these appalling exchanges that Peter Mandelson had with Jeffrey Epstein, he would never have appointed him. And I know Keir is a man of great decency and integrity, and that's absolutely right. He wouldn't have appointed him. He obviously didn't know these things. He was dealing with a unique set of circumstances around President Trump, and that's why he made the decision.
The problem with this is that everybody knew that there was a relationship with Epstein in the past. Didn't know the details of it, hadn't seen those last lethal emails and texts, I grant you, but everybody knew about that. Wasn't that therefore taking a huge risk in appointing him in the first place, given what's happened?
I make this point very gently, Andrew. When Peter Mandelson was appointed, I didn't hear much of a hue and cry from the media about Peter Mandelson's links with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, these were a matter of public record. He'd expressed regret about them, but there weren't lots of people in the media saying you can't possibly appoint this man. So that's why what Keir said today is clear, which is he said he had no idea about the extent and depth of the relationship, nor that Peter Mandelson was after the conviction saying you should push for early release and all of those terrible things that came out in these emails.
Right, well, let's turn. You talk about taking the fight to reform and to the right more generally. This weekend, we saw a massive, I don't know what you'd call it, anti-immigration or English nationalist, British nationalist demonstration on the streets of London. And at that demonstration, Elon Musk, very close associate in the past of Donald Trump, the world's richest man, said to the crowds, in terms that they should turn to violence, and in terms suggested it was time to overthrow the elected British government. What's your reaction?
Who the hell is this guy, is my reaction. Just because you're a billionaire, it doesn't give you a right to come and tell us how to run our country. And look, as far as I can see, this guy is a publicity-seeking narcissist who is inciting violence on our streets. And honestly, he should go back to running his car company, and I think, as the Americans would say, butt out of our politics.
Here. Absolutely. And you see what's going on the right of politics. You can see people turning very angrily against Islam in particular. And at the same time, Nigel Farage is trying to, as it were, police his right flank as well as his other flank. We've had today probably one of the brightest and most ambitious, most admired Conservative MPs, Danny Kruger, defect to Reform. Do you now worry that Reform is, as it were, becoming an alternative Conservative party, which is even more of a threat to you at an election time?
Look, I think, to take the first part of your question very seriously, there is a fragility about the atmosphere in the country, which I think we should sort of acknowledge. There are people who are hurting and angry. There are people on the far right who want to use that and whip people up. You know, I think if you take the flag isn't owned by anyone. It's certainly not owned by the far right. Patriotism isn't owned by anyone. And so I think we both, what's important is both to deal with people's legitimate concerns about issues, about small boats and so on, but also to say, you know, I was really struck by this story about a black grandfather who was playing with his white grandchildren in a park, and it somehow got onto social media and got wider publicity, and then he was subject to the most appalling hate. I mean, we are Britain. We are better than this. We are better than this. And, you know, some of the demons from the 1980s are rearing their heads. There are legitimate issues about immigration that need to be dealt with. But what we are not going to do, and what we as a Labour government will not do, is stay silent about prejudice and racism wherever it rears its head.
Well, let's talk about our individual responsibility over all of this, because almost all of us use X at the moment. And given what you have said about Elon Musk, and that came, I think, from the heart, perhaps we should stop using X. Do you think the political world, including the Labour Party, should pull back now?
We probably should look at that. I mean, I many years ago gave up looking at social media myself, but that's sort of easy for me to say because there are people who post on X for me. But, I mean, you know... I think all of these issues need to be looked at. And, you know, I'm really struck that you can meet people in real life who are very different in real life than they are on social media.
Social media is not the real world.
Yeah, and all of us have to sort of think about the tone of our sort of political debate. But you know, we also have to protect the I think there's a very significant, decent majority in this country that is appalled when people like Elon Musk come and start inciting violence. And you know, tolerance, respect, all of those things are great British values that need defending.
If during this big visit, very important visit by Donald Trump this week, we're hearing from either him or people around him what we have heard in the past, which is London is over, Britain is over, it's done, all the kinds of things that Elon Musk has been saying in the past. Is this a government which has the cojones to actually stand up and say the opposite? To speak truth to that power?
I'm sure we are. And look, I just hope we don't hear that. I think it's important to say, and you see this with what we said on nuclear today, it's important to work with our closest ally, the US. And, you know, even on an issue like energy, we've found common ground around, you know, both of us see new nuclear as part of the future, energy security, good jobs. And I think actually one of the great things that Keir Starmer's done is he's managed to manage this relationship with President Trump to the benefit of Britain, you know, protecting jobs at JLR.
But it's an awkward dance, isn't it?
Well, look, I think it's a really hard thing that he's doing, and I think he's done it with incredible skill. But look, if what you're asking me is, should this government give no quarter in defending our values? 100%. 100%. That is so important, and I know that's what Keir believes as well.
Really interesting. Now, you mentioned nuclear modular reactors. Yes. Just now. One thing that slightly puzzles me genuinely about this announcement, it's a very good announcement, very good for Hartlepool, 2,500 new jobs, all of that. Yeah. But I thought this is being built by an American company, X Energy. I thought Rolls-Royce, I thought British companies were going to build these reactors.
You can have more than one fleet. Look, that's what's so exciting about this. So we had this competition, and in the spending review, we announced the biggest nuclear building program for half a century, Sizewell C, small modular reactors built by Rolls-Royce. But we then said...
this is additional to all of that.
We then said, well, look, there are some people who didn't win the competition, but they might want to come and invest here too. And so that's what my department's been working with them on. So you've got X Energy and Centrica, you've got Holtec and EDF. So you've got companies coming forward and saying, look, we're going to need so much electricity in the future. We've got to get off fossil fuels. We want to come and invest in Britain. I think it's a big vote of confidence in our whole clean power mission.
One last question about little local difficulties. Paul Ovenden, head of strategy, an appalling series of messages about Diane Abbott, so far as we can tell. Is there a slightly too macho, boyish atmosphere around number 10, frankly and candidly?
Look, I don't want to sort of comment on that. I think what I'll say is I haven't seen the messages, but I gather they are appalling. And look, this is, they've been dealt with and Paul has left. And that's the kind of standards that Keir Starmer wants to uphold. And that, again, I think it's the kind of thing that he would never have engaged in or indulged in. I know him well as a person, and I think it's not who he is. Look, individual advisors go, but what's important is that the mission of the government remains, and we remain focused on that.
Well, Ed Miliband, this has been a really good and vigorous conversation. Thank you so much for coming in. As we were discussing, the Tory MP and Shadow Minister Danny Kruger has defected to the Reform Party this morning, and he had some scathing words for his former party in the process. Now, you're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr, and the time is now 6:20.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
Why this staggering level of incompetence?
Straight to the point.
This is the economics of the madhouse from this government.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
She does seem to struggle with her sums.
Listen on Global Player or the new LBC app. Download it now from your app store. LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
It's 6:22. Danny Kruger, who's one of the most thoughtful and ambitious of the younger Conservative MPs, defected this morning to Nigel Farage's Reform Party, declaring the Tories were over.
The flame is passing from one torch to another. The old torch, once so great, is guttering, spluttering, held weakly in uncertain hands. But the new torch is already alight, already brighter than the one it is replacing, held aloft in firm and confident hands.
Now, this is, however you cut it, terrible news for the Conservatives and their leader, Kemi Badenoch. Kruger has developed a distinctive brand of conservatism, very much based around family values and religion and patriotism. So what is it about his old party that isn't working, and what is it about his new one, apart from the strong performance in the opinion polls, of course, that rouses former Tories? I'm joined now by our political editor, Natasha Clarke, who interviewed the man himself earlier today. Natasha, this is no ordinary Conservative MP. This is somebody who, for a lot of people, was the future of the Conservative Party, once defined as the most Tory of all Tory MPs.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously he's the first sitting MP as well to make the jump over to Reform. And that is something that people have been telling me today is really significant for Reform. And people are describing this as quite a seismic moment, quite a big jump for him to have made. And of course, like you say, he is someone who's got his career ahead of him, not behind him.
I don't want to be rude about anybody else, but many of the people who've gone over are frankly
he's not
old
a Tory
hat.
Has been.
Old
he's
hat.
not.
He's coming in. So this is actually particularly sinister for the Conservative Party.
Exactly. And I think what Nigel Farage wants him to be is that professionalism, that ideas that they desperately need. They desperately need someone with the professionalism that can make their party ready for government. And that's exactly what he was saying at that press conference that he hopes today to do.
Well, I've listened very carefully, and I've seen Nigel Farage himself talking much more about family and family values recently and community, and that is very much Danny Kruger's kind of conservatism. Again, tell us a little bit more about the man, because he was born in South Africa, I think, comes from a very, very strong conservative background.
Yeah, absolutely. And he is very family values, and he's very religious. He's spoken very powerfully in the assisted dying debate. First elected in 2019, sort of worked with Boris Johnson as his private secretary as well. So has a little bit of experience of what it's like turning ideas into reality and turning ideas into actually governing. So I think that is exactly what Nigel Farage hopes he can bring to the Reform Party. That's much desperately needed.
Quite a few of the Tories who've hopped over to Reform are Boris Johnson-era Tories, aren't they?
They are, and I think that is privately something. I asked him actually earlier today, I was like, do you hope that Boris Johnson will join you? And that's something I think privately behind the scenes, many people in Reform would like to see. Obviously, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson don't have as much of a positive history together, apart from, of course, that deal that they did in 2019.
I wonder if it would be a good idea, because if Boris Johnson is, of course, also the person responsible post-Brexit for that massive increase in legal migration.
Exactly, and that was another question that was put to Danny Kruger today at this press conference. You work with Boris Johnson. That is something that many sort of Reform voters absolutely do not want to countenance. So there are swings and roundabouts to this, but I do think that many people are telling me today, obviously the Tories want to brush it off, but Reform are seeing this as a really, really big moment for them today.
I have noticed clips on social media of Danny Kruger in the Commons attacking Reform very recently for spending money like a drunken sailor. Was he asked at all about that?
He was asked about that as well, and absolutely, he's a stellar media performer. He was able to brush off all of those comments. But yes, this is part of Nigel Farage's mission to make the party, turn it into an actual party of government rather than a party of protest, and that's exactly what this press conference was today.
Natasha, thank you very much. And now to respond to those withering comments from Danny Kruger about the death of the Conservative Party, let's hear from one of the more senior Conservatives who lost his seat in the last election, but formerly held the positions of both Levelling Up Secretary and Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke. Simon, thank you very much for coming in. Your reaction to what happened?
Well, I'm very sad that Danny's gone, and I wouldn't disagree with anything that Natasha said about what a thoughtful and decent man Danny is. He's extremely capable, extremely likeable, and I am really, really sad that he doesn't think that his future sits in the Conservative Party. But I do disagree with his diagnosis of things, and it's the old line about the obituaries and the rest are much ahead of the game, right? This is actually something which, to me,
write the obituary too fast.
Well, exactly right. I mean, the Conservative Party's been around for 300 years. We have got massive lessons to learn from the disaster of 2024. But do I think that Reform are the answer to the country's challenges? No, they have one very clear message on immigration, but what do they think of on housing, the health service, the economy?
They have got policies on these things.
Well, they do, but fundamentally, most of them, if you press them, disintegrate on touch. And if there's one lesson of the last government, it's that you've got to actually have a credible plan to govern. I mean, that's also what's obviously haunting this one.
Isn't that why today's announcement is so damaging, worrying for the Conservative family? Because if Danny is the first and you get more and more of the younger, ambitious, thoughtful Conservatives hopping over the fence, you suddenly find yourself looking at a genuinely rival party to yours, and a party which perhaps has a better leader, perhaps has more of the future to it.
Well, I wish Danny luck in trying to make Reform philosophically coherent. I don't think they agree internally, even though they are a relatively small group of MPs, on key issues. And I think that will be exposed even more if they try and straddle, as populists will have to try and do, a much larger number of MPs in the next Parliament. There is little that unites beyond their stance on migration, and I don't think they are the answer. And I think that it's very important actually that we draw out that authentic Conservatives stay with the Conservative Party because we want to govern Britain differently. Reform, although they have, as I say, one particular stance on immigration, look at their economic policy, and that is, in essence, closer to Labour than it is to us.
Let me prod that incoherent point a little bit more, because it seems to me, looking at a lot of Reform policies around welfare and the NHS, they are an interesting there is a kind of position there, which is very, very hard, tough on law and order and to migration and those issues, but quite big state compared to the Conservative Party.
It feels to me like a flavour in some ways of old Labour, and I don't think Danny will find that a particularly comfortable home. So, it's not about the things which Conservatives believe in, an opportunity society, an enterprise culture. We have got an enormous amount to do to recast our economic message. But what Danny was saying 2 months ago today, about reform spending like a drunken sailor, is not far from the truth. Their manifesto in 2024 had an 80 billion black hole. They've already said they want to repeal the two-child benefit cap. These are not costed policies, and fundamentally, in the absence of economic growth of an order which has not been seen for a generation, I don't know where the money for that is going to come from. And critically, I think if Danny was here, he wouldn't be able to say that either.
And a word of support for your leader, apparently holding the flame of conservatism in unsteady hands.
All I would say is that there is a long way to go in this Parliament, and the Kemi Baden that I know has a very steady grip. So look, there's obviously loads to do. Kemi inherited a dreadful situation. It hasn't been an absolutely easy first year, and that is part of the process, as she has candidly said, of learning. But Mrs Thatcher learnt too, and if you looked at the reviews of her first year as a leader of the Conservative Party, there were some pretty dire reviews then too.
One thing we're all relearning is that politics is a really, really hard trade. Simon, Natasha, thank you both so much. Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, the harrowing story of a couple on the run after the death of their newborn baby girl, were sentenced this afternoon. LBC's reporter Helen Hoddinott was in court, and she'll be here to give us the very latest. But the time now, 6:30. And Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
Ed Miliband has told LBC Sir Keir Starmer will remain focused on the British people following a difficult few weeks in government. The Net Zero Secretary has been speaking on Tonight with Andrew Marr after the PM admitted in hindsight he wouldn't have appointed Lord Mandelson. A couple who took their newborn baby on the run to avoid her being taken into care have been jailed for gross negligence manslaughter. Constance Martin and Mark Gordon have been jailed for at least 14 years. And 8 people have been charged after disorder broke out during protests in central London. Thousands of people turned out for right-wing activist Tommy Robinson's Unite the Kingdom rally on Saturday. LBC weather staying very windy tonight. Showers for Northern Ireland, South Scotland, central Northern England and Wales. Lows of 7 degrees.
On the latest episode of The Newsagents.
We're talking about Tommy Robinson's Unite the Kingdom rally on Saturday and the political reaction to it. Why has the Labour government and so many other parties been so unwilling to call out Elon Musk for his calls to violence in this country? Is that how far the Overton window has shifted? You can listen now on our free Global Player app.
Get the latest episode of The Newsagents with Emily Maitlis, John Sopel and Lewis Goodall. Listen or watch on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app.
Apply.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:33. Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, the couple who vanished in January 2023 with their newborn baby who later died, were together sentenced to more than 28 years in jail earlier today. The child's body, you may remember, was found in bitterly cold weather, wrapped in a shopping bag in an allotment shed, and they were convicted of causing her death by gross negligence. Helen Hoddinott, LBC's reporter in the court, joins me now. Helen.
So, Andrew, today was the culmination of a trial and then a retrial of Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, both trials beset by delays and disruption by the couple. They often refused to turn up to court, claiming they were ill. They also fired more than a dozen barristers between them. And today's hearing was also tense. Judge Mark Lucraft, KC, had to stop proceedings multiple times to tell the couple, who were sitting just a few metres away from each other, to stop talking to each other and to stop passing notes. Handing down his sentence, he said the couple have not shown, in his opinion, any genuine expression of remorse after baby Victoria's death in a freezing tent in 2023.
To most right-thinking people, their children are the most precious beings, to be nurtured and cared for, to be kept warm, to be fed, even at the expense of parents' own comfort, and above all, to be loved. What you did towards baby Victoria, despite all you claim to have done, can only be described as neglect of the gravest and most serious type that led ultimately to her death by your gross negligence.
So the couple met about a decade ago. Constance Martin is from an aristocratic family with royal ties, while Mark Gordon has previously served 20 years in prison in the US for sexually assaulting a woman at knife point when he was a teenager, before he was then deported back to the UK, which is where he was born.
And people may remember the burning car and then the mystery about where they had escaped to and what had happened to the baby. I said they 28 years together. Is that 14 years each?
They were sentenced to 14 years each, with him having to serve an extra 4 on licence because of his perceived dangerousness by the judge.
Helen, a very, very important case. Thank you so much for coming in. Let's go back to the politics now. The defence Keir Starmer gave this afternoon over the Peter Mandelson scandal on a day when he lost another advisor who'd sent atrocious messages about Diane Abbott, and when he's still under intense internal pressure. His biographer, Tom Baldwin, is with me now. So not a difficult week by normal standards, actually a nightmare.
It's certainly not the kind of week or the kind of re-entry into political turn that Keir Starmer would have wanted. But I take the sort of slightly unfashionable view that what you've seen over him in the last couple of weeks is actually what he promised he would be when he talked about restoring trust in politics. He said that he would set a very high ethical bar for his colleagues, for ministers, for appointments.
And he'd act quickly.
And when presented with evidence-based government, he would act. And that's what he's done.
So, I mean, the obvious pushback to that is Peter Mandelson's record of connections with Epstein, and his record of taking big jobs, doing them very well perhaps, but then having to leave in difficult circumstances, he said politely. Surely looking at that, appointing him was a mistake in the first place.
Well, with hindsight, you can say that. There's an awful amount of hindsightery going on in the media at the moment. A lot of the media are now saying he should have known. We're lauding this appointment as a masterstroke, how brilliant it was. There weren't great debates on the BBC or LBC at the time, I believe, about whether Peter Mandelson was an inappropriate appointment. Keir Starmer knew what you knew and what I knew, on the basis that he appointed him. As he says, if he had known then what he knows now, he wouldn't have appointed him. That is ethical, evidence-based government.
And would you say the same goes for the advisor who was forced to resign or was sacked today as well? The head of strategy, Paul Ovenden.
I know Paul and I like Paul, and I think his loss will be felt very keenly by Keir Starmer, actually, because he's quite close to him. But again, he sets very high standards, and it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter if they're a close friend or not. If they don't meet those standards, they're out the door. Now, we can criticise politicians for breaking promises, and we do. When actually fulfilling a promise is what he said he'd do before the last election, I think it's worth pointing out sometimes.
It's said, I don't know if it's true, that he doesn't read very much in terms of things written about him or critical of him, and he lives inside his own number 10 world. What do you think he's feeling? Do you think he feels he's under intense pressure, as everybody says, or do you think he's as calm as ever?
I think you can know you're under intense pressure and stay calm in the face of storms. I think he spent a large part of the summer actually talking to people way beyond the bunker and thinking quite hard about the direction he wanted the government to take and how to tell that story better.
People like Louise Casey.
I think he consulted far and wide, not always, the same old people around him. And that's important because, I don't think he has shown the values that he has. I think he has this sort of sense of decency and tolerance and moderation, respect for very British things like the rule of law, which are very familiar to people, but we haven't seen that side of him. And this is, so when you talk, they talk about this reset, or what I think he needs to do this autumn is connect up all those bullet points we've had. We've had all those missions, those measurable milestones, and connect them up with some values, a sense of a Labour story, a British story, which is very different to the far-right populism reform.
He has to make the speech of his life at conference, doesn't he? Well, connecting those things together and finding a kind of voice. I think you'd have to agree, he has not been a sort of rhetorical Prime Minister of the kind we've had so often in the past. I know he doesn't really like that idea, but at some point you have to give people a story that they can emotionally connect to.
He's a better speaker than he's sometimes given credit for, but I don't think I think it's sort of, the media want to say, look, this has to be the speech of his life and create another big moment. What's important is over the weeks and months ahead that he shows the connection between policy, what Labour are doing, lots of great things they're doing, like, whether it's workers' rights or net zero, which you've just been talking to Miliband about, and connect it up into a story about the future, about what a Labour government does. And I don't think people have always felt that this is a Labour government being Labour. You've just got to get that sort of sense of his values out clearer. And the speech is one way to do that, but another way to do it is actually delivering on the things that they've said.
Here's a strange proposition. Perhaps Tommy Robinson and Elon Musk have done him a great favour. Because if you say, when's he going to find his voice? I mean, I keep saying this. When he certainly found his voice today when he talked about a battle for the soul of the nation between people who would like to divide us and drive us away from each other and those who want to bring us together.
Yeah, look, he said the same to me when I interviewed him for The Observer for the first anniversary in the new version of my book. And he said, look, the next election is going to be between us and reform. It's a battle for the heart and soul of this nation. It's us, a progressive Labour Party, up against far-right populists. And that's the point. You may not like everything about this government. I don't like everything about this government. You may not like everything about Keir Starmer. But politics is a choice. And if this government fails, it's not going to be replaced by some nice sort of moderate Conservative government or Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. It's going to be replaced by something we've never seen before in this country. A kind of politics which, when they do something wrong, they don't resign, they don't get sacked, they lord in it, they roll around in it, they boast about it. That's the kind of politics we see across the Atlantic in America. That's the kind of politics they want to import here. And the politics that Keir Starmer stands for is the opposite of that, and he needs to tell that story.
And in telling that story, it comes down to particular policies, as you said yourself. Would you agree that if the boats are not stopped, if there is not some sense that this government has got a grip of illegal migration and started to get those numbers down fairly dramatically, the game is over?
Well, I think you have to, look, if they carry on talking about boats for the next 4 years, they're going to lose the next election. They do need to show that they're securing borders, a basic function of state. But the boats are a problem, not a crisis, a problem that's existed since 2018. It's been growing slowly, year in, year out, and there are complex solutions to a complex problem. The people who think this is simple, I can just do that, they are the people we need to be worried about, because those simple solutions are what's got this country into the bother it's in at the moment.
Final thought. The so-called soft left, or bits of it, the Manchester soft left, are coming for Keir Starmer. It's pretty clear that Andy Burnham would like to get back into Parliament, fight in a Manchester seat, get back into Parliament, and in those circumstances challenge Keir Starmer for the leadership. What would be the effect on the Labour government of a relatively long, drawn-out fight between the different wings of the Labour Party now?
Well, I mean... That's, if Andy Burnham does that, then that's a hypothetical question, and that would obviously be damaging. But I remember when I talked to Keir Starmer about this a few months ago, and he said he doesn't really mind when people like you say they're coming for him, or he's got only a certain amount of time left, or he's going to be out before the next election, because he said they're making the same mistake they've always made about me. They're underestimating me. And there's 3 former Conservative Prime Ministers who can testify to that. So I wouldn't underestimate Keir Starmer. He has huge reserves of resilience. He's got great values. I think we've seen the resilience. We now need to see the values.
Well, there is the case for the defence, as I suggest Keir Starmer himself couldn't make it to me. But thank you very much indeed for doing your best on board. I'm sure, I rather doubt it, but there we are. Anyway, 14 National Health Service trusts are facing a national investigation into their maternity care of what have been described as failures in the system. I'll be talking to Baroness Valerie Amos, who's leading those investigations. With the time now, 6:44.
Coming up at 7, Ian Dale leading Britain's conversation. Next on LBC. Leading Britain's conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
It's 6:45. From Blackpool to Oxford, King's Lynn to Kent, the NHS in England has had some terrible failures in maternity care. Genuinely tragic stories have been recorded all around the country, and now the former Minister Baroness Valerie Amos is to conduct an examination of 14 trusts over failures in the system, including the failure to hear women's voices, bad leadership and toxic cultures. And she's here with me in the studio now. Now, Valerie Amos, you're a great supporter of the NHS. You don't like the word failure. Nonetheless, there have been systemic problems. Can you just explain to people listening what kind of things you're looking for?
There have been huge systemic failures, Andrew, and I have to tell you that speaking and listening to the families, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, there are so many different aspects that they talk about, and one of the things that I'm really bothered about is the fact that there have been so many reviews, so many recommendations, and yet we still seem to be repeating the same thing time and time again. So you asked me, what are some of those things? You mentioned the lack of listening, the lack of compassion. People talk all the time about the failure of the regulatory bodies, the fact that nobody says sorry, the way that things go instantly into some kind of legal system, the fact that it takes years to find out exactly what happened. And these are families who have been left bereaved and harmed. And I've been very grateful that they have spoken to me, but they are having to tell their story too many times.
Yes, again.
So what I've been asked to do is a rapid review to try to come up with one set of national recommendations which can be implemented. The Secretary of State for Health and Social Care is putting together a task force which will include families, it will include experts, it will include campaigners who will drive the implementation.
Can you explain, Lady Amos, the sort of mystery of why it is maternity care that's been such a problem? Because, you know, there's all sorts of departments in all sorts of hospitals, orthopaedic care, cancer care and so forth. For some reason, there seems to be a particular problem in the NHS in England around maternity. Have you any idea why?
Well, I can't say why yet. I really need to look at what's happening, look back at all of these reviews, the endless recommendations that have been made, how many have been implemented, how many have not, what are the gaps in care, so we can provide safe care. I cannot answer the question of why maternity, but I have a few thoughts. I cannot prejudge the outcome. But one of the things the women say to me all the time is, we know our bodies. Nobody is listening to us when we say something has gone wrong. That is clearly one of the big things we need to look at. And then another thing is, if you make a mistake, it's life or death or significant harm. And I think the culture within some trusts, I would not say within every single trust, but that is not the sense I get. The culture is one of, you worry if you think that you have made a mistake. We need a culture that is much more transparent and open.
Is it too simplistic, therefore, to say that part of the problem might be in the specific cases of a maternity hospital or a maternity ward, the old adage, doctor knows best, might be too aggressive, might be wrong?
Well, I'm not sure that that's an adage that works for many areas any longer. I think the
doctors think it does.
Well, I'm not sure every single doctor think it does either. And of course, there is an issue of training, how multidisciplinary teams work. We have midwives and we have obstetricians as well as neonatal specialists. There is an absolute importance to work together, but in the way that each of these specialisms is trained, are they trained in a way that enables them to work well together? So there is a lot to look at here.
Lady Amos, it's a really big job, a very important job. The very best of luck with it. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, Royal Air Force jets are going to fly over Poland as part of a NATO mission, the government announced today. This comes after Russian drones breached Polish airspace last week, the most significant violation of NATO airspace since the Ukraine war began. Sam Kiley, World Affairs Editor at The Independent, is here to discuss that with me. Sam, how big a moment is this? I mean, obviously, NATO is interactive. They swap jets, they swap forces all the time. But British jets across Poland, we haven't seen before.
No, we haven't. And I think it's an important gesture. John Healey's I've just seen him on Sky talking about this, saying, that this is part of the NATO standing together when NATO is, in his words, threatened. And there's no question, I think, from any military perspective, that these drones did penetrate so far into Polish airspace last week that they were either an act of aggression or an act to test the response. And so NATO is showing, after the Poles have said that they want to discuss Article 4 of the NATO founding treaty, which is a convention that pulls them together as NATO to decide on what to do collectively. This is the British getting on the front foot and saying, well, we remember what the Poles did here in the Battle of Britain, and they're getting out there to protect Polish airspace as part of the NATO deterrent. Very striking silence so far from Donald Trump on the matter.
Well, you mentioned Donald Trump there. It does appear that for what he's been saying about sanctions on Russia, that he's backing away from all of that. He said all NATO countries would have to completely stop buying any Russian oil before he'd look at them. And in those circumstances, is this a moment where Vladimir Putin feels a bit emboldened, feels that the threat of real sanctions on his economy is actually not nearly as serious as he thought, and is therefore pushing ahead more aggressively than before?
Andrew, I think you're absolutely right. He definitely feels more emboldened every time Donald Trump splits the Western alliance. He's done it now over the issue of sanctions. American sanctions on Russia as such are meaningless because there's almost no trade between the two countries. Where it could bite as if he imposed sanctions on China or indeed on East European countries who are net importers of fossil fuel from the Russians. He does have a very important point here, though, which is the amount of money spent by European Union nations on Russian oil and gas exceeds the amount of money spent by European nations on defending Ukraine with military support.
Yeah, it is clearly a bit crackers. One other aspect of this that seems to be an escalation is that the huge Russian and Belarus military exercises are going to be joined by the Indians. The Indians are sending out troops and I don't know what else to Belarus to take part in those exercises just nose to nose with NATO, which, we know that India has a long-term relationship with Russia, always has had, but for a country we regard as friendly and has just done a big trade deal with us, this seems, to say the least, odd.
Yeah, it's a very bizarre development. I think what we're seeing there is India flexing its muscles as an independent nation, free from both the shackles of the West and arguably from its relationship, ironically, with Russia, showing itself to be a superpower to be reckoned with. I think it's very ill-judged. The Indian government is not famed for its nuance and subtlety. It is a populist government under Modi, very similar to the Trump government, preying on people's worst racist and racial hang-ups and prejudices, for example, a very nationalist government. So one shouldn't be too surprised that he's also got a bit of an eye for Vladimir Putin. But I think he's also got a main chance here for saying, look at us, we matter. I think the ancillary aspect of this is, of course, that the Indians buy a lot of equipment from the Russians, military equipment, and they probably want to test some of their equipment in a theatre very, very close to where the supposed enemy or rivals have the sort of equipment that they might come up against in any kind of future military operations. Not, that is to say, that there is any threat from India against NATO, but rather against the sorts of weapons that the West supplies.
Of course not. Well, it's just a story we obviously have to keep a close eye on. Sam Kiley, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Now, from one Trump story to another Trump story, because this has been one of the most consequential and high-profile battles of the social media world, the threat by the Trump administration to ban the Chinese-owned TikTok site from the United States. Now it seems a deal has nearly been reached, and as a sign that it's a big deal, Trump's expected to speak to the Chinese leader Xi Jinping himself later in the week. LBC technology correspondent Will Guyatt is with me now. And Will, the essence of this is that Larry Ellison, who was briefly a few days ago the world's richest man, is likely to buy TikTok in America. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's an incredible story in that Larry Ellison is currently in the process of trying to buy, via his son's new ownership of Paramount, the film studio. They're also trying to buy Warner Brothers Discovery at the same time. So wow. You find yourself in a fairly unique situation where essentially today we've seen a deal announced. We don't know any detail or context yet. What are they buying? That's the big question for me, Andrew, because at one point ByteDance were absolutely insistent that there was no deal to be done. And if there was a deal to be done, they wouldn't be selling the secret algorithm, the thing that powers the news feed, the thing that makes TikTok so attractive to its 135 million plus US users. And also, is this a completely international deal? Do they then become responsible for the business outside of China, or is this a US only deal? So an awful lot of questions still to come, but it would appear that, Larry Ellison, who is the boss of Oracle, and Oracle, the tech company, do a lot of the back-end server work, so keeping TikTok running in the US and globally. So they've got familiarity with the business with ByteDance, the Chinese owner, already. So that looks as though the direction it was going. When it nearly happened a few years ago, we were in a situation where it looked like even Walmart were keen at one point to buy it. So let's see what happens over the next few days as to whether we've got Ellison or if it's a conglomerate of US businesses looking to buy it.
Will, you know perfectly well that you're talking to an old git here. I did download TikTok once and it terrified me and confused me so much I cancelled it immediately. But, there's X, there's Instagram, there's all these different social media sites, he said hurriedly because he couldn't remember any other ones, and there's TikTok. What has made TikTok quite so spectacularly successful?
I think TikTok has been very popular with younger audiences to start with because of the power of the recommendation, the power of the algorithm. When you start following a certain few accounts or you express interest and engage with certain videos, Andrew, it's really cracked the art of showing you more stuff, which keeps you engaged with it for longer. Mark Zuckerberg's and others would all be very keen to follow what they do. It
basically sticks its fingers into your nose and pulls your brain out through your nostrils. I think, Will Guyatt. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I spoke to the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, earlier this evening, and we reflected on those incendiary comments by the ex-owner Elon Musk over the weekend, saying that violence is coming to the UK. What was Ed's reaction?
This guy is a publicity-seeking narcissist who is inciting violence on our streets. And honestly, he should go back to running his car company, and I think, as the Americans would say, butt out of our politics.
Very good. Now, if you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on both Global Player and the LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion. Put your news categories in the order you'd prefer them. Pause, rewind live radio, and listen to a range of podcasts. Download the official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Another week, another Conservative defection to Reform. Significant in some ways, but there's a growing feeling that Reform is merely becoming a home for Tory rejects, and that for an anti-establishment party, it's becoming, well, a bit too establishment.
The Conservative Party is unable to deliver, whereas Reform have set out what I think is a very coherent set of policy principles.
Danny Kruger, a man today being described as thoughtful and intelligent, a few months ago was talked of as a right-wing Trussite nutter. How time changes. He says the